Okay, let's leave the squirrels do their squirrel thing, and we'll just get back to this. So, they've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. Let's stop there just for a moment. I remember those sermons. The sermons where Paul, apostle to the Gentiles, did not see himself as being inferior to those pillars in the church. You know, the apostles. We read about how he confronted Peter when Peter withdrew from the Gentiles when the brothers from Jerusalem showed up. And how he said, "You hypocrite." And we read about how he talks about his own apostleship, and he says, even when we went to Jerusalem, those that seemed to be pillars. Now, of course, I throw my head that way because this is how, when people read some of this is how some people interpret it. It's not my interpretation only, because I've heard those kinds of interpretations placed on how Paul saw himself against the other Jewish apostles. Maybe from here we can get a little understanding as to why. Because when he shows up in Jerusalem, they're not asking Paul's advice. They're not asking Paul to say, "Paul, please give us your insight into this. Could you please give us some direction?" Paul shows up in town, and he's used to going from town to town, place to place, stirring up trouble. But when he shows up in Jerusalem, James and the elders are saying, "Paul, look at all the thousands of Jews who believe, and all of them are zealous for the law, but we've got a problem. These Jews who are zealous for the law, who've heard our message and believe, they've been told that you have been telling Jews in the diaspora, Jews who were living outside of Judea, outside of this region, that they are to no longer circumcise their children, and they are to turn away from Moses, and they're not to live according to the customs that we live by." At this point, it must be very frustrating for Paul, who's used to telling other people what to do, to now basically be put in this awkward position of having to then submit to what they're telling him. Because clearly, by the way, this is sarcasm, because clearly, if we read Paul's letters carefully, we understand Paul's doctrines. We've read Paul in Galatians, in Colossians, and Romans, speaking of the books that contain some pretty weighty theological, discussions. And in these books, he makes his opinion apparently quite clear. And based on what he wrote in those letters that Christians use to make the claim that the law is no more done away with, etc., 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 what do you suppose Paul does now that he's here in Jerusalem listening to these elders brag about all of these Jews who are still obeying the law, who are still caught up in legalism? What do you suppose he does? What would you do? I know what you'd do, because I suspect that before I'm done here, I'm going to have people talking about, there's no more law, we're set free from the law, blah, blah, blah. And so this is the point in Paul's life when you would expect Paul to say, brethren, or brethren, do you not know that we've been set free from the law? In Christ is the end of the law. Law and all its commandments have been nailed to the cross, abolished by the cross. Don't you know that? I mean, isn't that what he would get up and say? I mean, if you read the writings of Paul, that's what you would conclude he believed. And therefore, you would think that would be a reasonable response to these Jews bragging about all of these other Jews keeping all of the Jewish laws while believing in JC. I'm fairly certain that's what most evangelicals would do. I'm fairly certain that most would get up and proclaim the gospel of freedom from the law. And the problem is that Paul didn't say a word. Not one word. Now, Luke, who is a friend of Paul, a companion of Paul's, wrote the book of Acts. And we have very good reason to believe that he was with Paul when this happened. So it's not like we're getting someone else's point of view or someone else's perspective and it didn't get in there. Luke was traveling with Paul and was writing this down, and Paul says nothing.